Hello, Rebecca here from SimpleSuburbanLiving.us. In this video, I'm going to share with you how to dehydrate tomatoes and then how to make tomato powder out of your dehydrated tomatoes. So the first thing that you're going to do is wash the tomatoes. Now, I know that this seems like a no-brainer, but I wanted to mention it just because even if they're from your garden or they're organic from the store, you still want to just make sure that they're nice and clean. So go ahead and give them a good wash. Okay, step number 2, you want to core your tomatoes. After you've washed the tomatoes, the next step, if they're cluster tomatoes like I used, is to remove the stems and then you will core them. Step number 3, cut up the tomatoes. Now, in the past, I had always sliced my tomatoes in the same way that you would slice them to put them on a burger. But I watched a YouTube video that explained that when you do it that way, a lot of the juice from the tomatoes drips out of the tomatoes, and then the dehydrated tomatoes don't have as much flavor. So the video that I watched, the person recommended that you instead cut the tomatoes in half and then put them on the dehydrator with the cut side up. So I gave that a try, but when I put them into the dehydrator, you can see that they were too thick and the dehydrator trays didn't fit together right. Now, obviously, a lot of this has to do with the size of your tomatoes. If you have plum tomatoes or maybe smaller tomatoes that were similar to what I have but smaller, then it might work for you. So try cutting them in half and lay them with the cut side up and see if your dehydrator will close. If it won't close, then you'll need to cut them more. I tried cutting them in fourths and then I ended up cutting them into eighths, and I was able to fit the trays together properly. Okay, step number 4, you place the tomatoes on the dehydrator trays. Now note that I have them spaced out so that they aren't touching. While this isn't 100% necessary, if you crowd them or pile them on top of each other, they'll take longer to dry. So if you have the room, just go ahead and spread them out a little bit and they'll dry better. I actually started with 5 pounds of tomatoes and I ended up using 4 dehydrator trays. Now I also used the screens on the trays because I feel like they're easier to clean than the trays, but you don't have to use screens if you don't have them. Step number 5. Once you load up all of your trays, you want to dehydrate them at 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, tomatoes have a high water content, so at 6 hours in, they were just starting to dry, but still had a long ways to go. You can see how they're kind of shriveled up a little bit, but still not anywhere close to being dehydrated. So at this point, I went to bed and I kept the dehydrator going all night long, which is perfectly fine. It's perfectly safe to keep it going all night long or while you're away at work or shopping or anything like that. So I kept them going all night long. And when I got up in the morning, the tomatoes on the top tray were pretty dry, but the lower trays still had a ways to go. This was about 15 hours in, and if you look at the edges of the tomatoes, you can see that there's a little bit of plumpness to them, so there was still quite a bit of moisture. So what I did at this point was I rotated the trays and I continued to run the dehydrator. All in all, it ended up taking about 24 hours for the tomatoes to be completely dry. Now, depending on how dry you want them, as well as other factors, it could take more or less time than that to dry. For example, if you live in a real humid area, it may take a bit longer, or if you cut the pieces thinner, it may take less time. Also, I tend to like to dry my tomatoes or whatever it is that I'm dehydrating until they're crisp. So if I test them and they're bendable, I put them back in to dry more. The reason I do this is because if moisture is still in the fruit or vegetables, that's what can cause them to go bad. So unless you're going to use them really soon, you want them to be really, really dry, and then you can store them for a long time that way. Also, I wanted to make powder with mine, and they just don't work well unless they're really dry. So I'm going to show you how I made the powder in just a minute. But in the meantime, I wanted to show you how much I ended up with. I dehydrated 5 pounds of tomatoes, and I ended up with a little less than a quart. You could probably fit 6 pounds of tomatoes into a 1-quart size jar. Okay, let's talk about tomato powder. All you have to do to make tomato powder is grind your dehydrated tomatoes. So I decided to try using my food processor to grind up the tomatoes. I usually use my coffee grinder, but it's so small that it takes a lot of work to grind things. So I thought, well, maybe it'll be faster to use the food processor. And that worked to some degree, but they weren't grinding as well as I would have hoped. Now, it's possible that this was because there was still some moisture in the tomatoes. And as you can see in this photo, the powder kind of stuck to the bowl of the food processor. Now, I don't know if that was heat from the food processor or if there was still moisture in the tomatoes, but it kind of caked onto the sides and it just wasn't grinding up as finely as I'd like. So I ended up using a coffee grinder and it worked really well. Since the powder may have had a bit of moisture in it, I decided to put the powder back in the dehydrator for a couple more hours just in case. Now, after everything was said and done, I ended up with about 2/3 cup of tomato powders from 5 pounds of tomatoes. So you can imagine how much that shrank down, how much that condensed the tomatoes. Okay, now let's talk about how to make tomato sauce or tomato paste with your tomato powder. The good news is it's super easy to make tomato sauce or paste from your tomato powder. All you have to do is stir water into the tomato powder. I used 1/4 cup of water and 1 tablespoon of powder. And it actually came out just a little bit thinner than I would prefer. So next time, I'd probably try a heaping tablespoon of powder to 1/4 cup water. For tomato paste, simply use less water. And you might need to experiment a bit to get the ratio just right. So if the consistency matters to you, start with less water and add a bit more if needed. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to dehydrate tomatoes and make tomato powder. If you'd like written instructions, be sure to visit simplesuburbanliving.us/dehydrating-tomatoes. And if you enjoyed this video, it would mean the world to me if you'd click on the like button and subscribe. Thanks so much. Have a great day and happy dehydrating.